Social movements. These are collective efforts based on common purposes and social solidarities using non-institutionalized methods to bring about social change. Moreover, social movements often go against power holders and authorities in response to situations of inequality or oppression, as well as unmet demands. So bear in your mind the words non-institutionalized methods to bring about social change, because in other words, social movements are civic organizations using informal procedures or informal processes to influence policymaking. Examples include labor groups calling for the increase in minimum wage, activist groups calling for fair investigations, and professional groups, in this case, the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, calling for government transparency. But what has changed since President Duterte came into power? How is the relationship between the current administration and the Philippine left today? And lastly, what are the key issues confronting the Philippine social movements today? I am Arcale Deraco, a fourth-year political science student from Cebu Normal University and an intern of Sir Ryan Dave Ryla. Today, we will talk about the Philippine social movements after martial law, from 2016 to present, or in other words, under the administration of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. Now, this discussion will only focus on these 3 points. First, we will talk about how Rodi ascended to prominence and what were his significant changes to the political and social structure of Philippine society. Second, we will try to understand the relationship between the Philippine left, or commonly known as the progressive groups, and the Duterte's administration. Lastly, I will point out the glaring issues confronting the Philippine social movements today due to the changes implicated by this administration. Now, let's delve into the ideas revolving around the rise of Rudy to power and his political style and the underlying ideologies. Notice that I have included the 17th century Italian philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli because later on we will understand why he is relevant to Duterte's ascent to power. Now, the reemergence of strongman politics. Let me remind you about the term strongman because it is oftentimes misunderstood as two separate words when it is clearly one. No? When you are a strongman, it is characterized to be an authoritarian rule which heavily utilizes the military for its functions when it is even inappropriate to use these instrumentalities. One glaring example is the COVID response of Duterte, and more subtle examples include the appointment of ex-cop and ex-generals in major positions in government. Now let us understand how Rudy captured the masses, and in order to do so, we must first discuss the context on how he captured the masses, the popular vote. Now, according to Richard Hidarian, a well-known political scientist, one factor on how Rodi captured the popular vote is the dissatisfaction of the people with the post-Marcos elite democracy. According to him, the rise of strong men across the world came as the liberal establishment failed to inspire public support and cope with new challenges of globalization. Now, if we recall in our previous classes, the nature of globalization creates winners and losers. Globalization is fueled by a neoliberal agenda, that is capitalism. Now, under the Aquino administration, economic boom and our business position to the global site was appealing for foreign investors. In fact, when Aquino left the palace, he left with 6% GDP growth. However, ironically, as the economy continues to progress, the poverty became very obvious. Criminality was rampant and traffic congestion in Manila became the worst in the world. Now this is when the time critics started to criticize Aquino's Daang Matuwid to be so self-righteous and hypocritical. Thus, the liberal brand of Aquino has failed to sustain public legitimation. Another factor on how Rudy captured the masses is his reliance on Machiavellian calculus, according to Haydarian. Duterte portrayed himself as a capable, decisive, simple living political outsider who could address the country's predicaments head on. One of the many things we can learn from Niccolo Machiavelli is that we don't really need to have all the virtues, but it is necessary to appear to have them for one to gain support and sympathy from the people. Now, Duterte proclaims swift salvation, which caught the hunger of the people for instant gratification. In other words, Duterte entered on the scene when the public are fervently searching for an alternative or even a contrast of Aquino's liberal brand. To continue, Julio Tihanqui, a known political scientist, described Duterte's political style as politics of anger. No? These are the areas where the previous administration suffered enormous failure. First is the lack of public service. Second, rampant criminality, a breakdown of peace and order. And third, corruption. Duterte politicized these national issues to gain public veneration, and it was admittedly very effective because even I, for one, was convinced at that time, no, that he was the next good leader for a country. Second is that Julio Tehanqui described the political style of Rodrigo Duterte as the massive repudiation of liberal democratic reforms. He changed the course of our political landscape dramatically, or as what Julio Tehanqui called as repudiation of liberal democratic reforms. Repudiation meaning rejection of and deviation from. No? In the words of Julio Tehanqui, it was hoped that the institution of the presidency would change him. Yet, after his first year in power, it has become apparent that it was Duterte who was changing the presidency. Major examples include the war on drugs, the hero's burial of the late dictator Marcos, and the strong attempt to reinstitute death penalty. These policies of Duterte is a major indication of his illiberal politics. Now, as Duterte continues to ravage our liberal political system, it is necessary to understand the basis of his socio-political and economic policies. Thus, experts situate Duterte as an ideology. One expert, Randy David, a sociologist, likens Duterte's ascent to power to the rise of Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy. It resembles aggressive and resentful political rhetoric against a purported enemy. No? Randy David described this as pure theater, a sensual experience rather than the rational application of ideas to society's problems. Now, if we can recall Duterte's proclamation that in order for one to be a good president, you have to be ready to kill, and it will become bloody during his presidency. Now, for Randy David, this is pure theater. No? It rides the emotional aspect of our being rather than the application of our rationality into solving society's problems. As early as May 1, 2016, Randy David coined the term Dutertismo, as Duterte have presented a somewhat unique form of political style. Now, it is important to put Duterte in this light as an ideology, to sway away from identity politics and understand the movement he has given life. Now, the effects of Dutertismo was versed by Nicole Corato, also a sociologist. Now, these are the glaring effects of Dutertismo to our society. First is the increasing role of police and military. For example, Duterte's war on drugs, and it has extended to the pandemic response. No, a health issue has now become primarily a law and order issue. Second is the discrediting of accountability mechanisms. In other words, the demonization of check mechanisms. Just take into account or put Dilemma and Sereno's case at point so that you can understand how this administration has demonized check mechanisms that is provided in our constitution. Third is the coarsening of political discourse. Examples include the mobilization of coordinated troll armies in social media. This has spread thuggish language and discourse to vilify detractors. No?
Now, why are we talking about Rudy when our topic is clearly about social movements? Let's delve into that a bit. First major point why we should talk about Rudy is that primarily he is the first Philippine president to have come from the southern island, Mindanao. Next, he is the first mayor president. In other words, he directly jumped from being a local government official to the highest seat of national office, from mayor to president. Then, he is the first blunt president to have used thuggish rhetoric against critical civic organizations, including the religious. Further, he has greatly changed our international relations in favor of China over our long term ally, the United States. And most importantly, he is the first president to have proclaimed himself as leftist and socialist, yet it has failed to materialize over the years because if we see his track record, it seems that he is maintaining the neoliberal agenda of the previous administrations. Second major point is that because of his massive repudiation of norms and liberal institutions and policies, which has already been mentioned earlier in this discussion. Hence, that is why I have discussed with you the re-emergence of strongman politics to understand the Philippine social movements today. And so, we must talk about and understand Rodi.
Now, let's proceed to our second salient topic, the Philippine left and Duterte. In this part, we will analyze and understand the relationship between the two. Notice that this is important because I am framing here the both sides of our political spectrum, the opposition and the government. At the early part of Duterte's presidential career, especially during the height of his campaigning, the left has its utmost support. According to Lamchek and Sanchez, the following reasons are why the Philippine left has supported Duterte. First is agenda alignment. This means that the Philippine left's interests coincided with Duterte's platform, like end labor contracting. Also, he criticized the environmental costs of large-scale mining. Moreover, Duterte also criticized the United States and promised for an independent foreign policy. And most importantly, Duterte promised to restart the peace talks with both Moro separatists and communists. Second reason is the endorsement from Joma Sison.
the founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines. Let us not forget that Duterte was a student of Joma Sison, and he became a member of the leftist youth organization Kabataang Makabayan, or Patriotic Youth. Third reason is the peace talks with more separatists and communists. Right after he won in the elections as the president-elect, Duterte wasted no time and formed a peace panel representing the Philippine government to meet with the rebels and communists in the Netherlands to talk peace. The fourth reason is the leftists' appointment to the cabinet. The following are known to be progressives who are truly dedicated to serve with integrity, like Rafael Mariano from the Department of Agrarian Reform, Judy Tagualo from the DSWD, and Liza Mata or Liza Maza from the National Anti-Poverty Commission. However, like Gina Lopez, their appointment was rejected by the Commission on Appointments without clear reasons later on. Through these reasons, Rudy was able to capture the Philippine left. However, the good relationship between the left and Duterte was short-lived. This is primarily because of a series of blows to the principles that the left stand by and the broken promises of Duterte during his bid for the presidency. This is also according to Lamchek and Sanchez. They have also detailed the relationship constraints between the two. First constraint is the war on drugs, which is very known for extrajudicial killings. This has heavily targeted the poor and later on encouraged vigilante killings against leftist activists. Second constraint is the failure to materialize socio-economic reforms against neoliberal policies. The left criticized the hypocrisy of Duterte's socialist self-proclamation as he continues to pursue neoliberal policies with the national oligarchs. Third constraint is the hero's burial of the late dictator Marcos. This has sparked enormous outrage from the left as it becomes a major rupture to the liberal and progressive agenda. Fourth constraint is the all-out war against communist insurgencies. When the peace talks in the Netherlands was still ongoing, there was no clear ceasefire agreement between the insurgents and the government. When news came up that a group of policemen were ambushed by alleged communist combatants, the peace talks quickly went south. This marks the start of the bloody war against communism to the point that fragile democratic institutions like the ACDIM are maliciously accused of breeding communists. In the following months, a string of peace consultants from the left and activists were slain in broad daylight. So, what can we get out from this? It can also be induced or deduced that social movements in the Philippines are still far from the utopia where the government recognizes its important role to nation building. Now, let me enlist the pressing issues confronting the Philippine social movements today. First is the erosion of liberalism. This also means the dilution of our freedoms and democratic institutions. Notice that today, going against or just by talking against a person in power gives us a sense of insecurity. Second is the scanty medical services. This is the most glaring problem we have, not just now, but especially in the future. If you have become numb and naive already, remember the darkest days of this pandemic. Third is the weak political party system. Experts and analysts are always pointing out the importance of a strong party system, that is, a political party system that truly stands on its principles and mission, not solely for political winnability purposes. Fourth is red tagging. If we remember the definition of social movements, it is a collective based efforts that usually go against power holders. And red tagging is very detrimental to its functions because to be red tagged is to be considered as an enemy of the state and subject to its strict control. Fifth is the rampant inflation. This is the heightening prices of basic commodities. This has led the many civic organizations to call for a higher minimum wage across the country because today we cannot do anything with 1 peso or even 5 pesos. Lastly, historical denialism and disinformation. This is the current battle because this has greatly shaped the outlook of the people in the coming national elections. This is the battle for truth, the fight against the Marcos vindication. There are several social movements today that are built solely to counter lies and expose truth. That is why I am encouraging you to join groups with similar purpose. Perhaps this may likewise put purpose in your life. To conclude our lecture for today, let me give you these passages from Schlossberg and Dreisek and Lamchek and Sanchez. According to Schlossberg and Dreisek, where the state does not see the social movement as linked to any of its core imperatives, the social movement's capacity to influence policy will be severely limited to the level of symbolic recognition or marginal rewards. In other words, in a nation like ours, where there is a clear disconnect between the state and civic organizations, the demands and grievances of the people oftentimes fall into the deaf ears and indifferent hearts of our politicians. Lastly, according to Lamchek and Sanchez, from a broader view of the history of progressive engagements with post-Marcos administrations, the failure of the left Duterte alliance also underscores and confirms the extreme difficulty of pursuing reform of and within the Philippines' elite democracy. This presents us the flaws and limitations of our current system. More importantly, this calls us to act upon these systemic problems and formulate rational solutions. So that is all for now. I would be very happy if some of you will reach me out through this email for any comments and feedback, anything about my presentation today. Just reach me at arcale999@gmail.com. Thank you and see you in our next discussion.